Most men don't realize when the shift happens. They feel it, something changed, but by the time they notice, the realignment is already complete. It starts quietly. A baby arrives, and suddenly the entire emotional architecture of the relationship gets rebuilt around one focal point. The child becomes the center, not temporarily, permanently, and the man doesn't just step to the side. He gets placed outside the structure entirely. This is where most people stop thinking. They assume this is natural, biological, temporary. They tell themselves it's a phase that will pass once the child is older, once sleep returns, once things settle. But that's not what happens. What happens is the distance becomes the new baseline. I want to pause here because this is not about whether women love their children. That's obvious. This is about something else entirely. About what happens to a relationship when one person becomes functionally invisible. Not hated, not resented, just no longer prioritized, no longer seen as requiring attention. Here's the part most women miss. Men don't announce when they feel erased. They don't sit down and say, I feel like I don't matter anymore. They adapt, they pull back, they stop expecting. And that adaptation, that quiet withdrawal, is often misread as patience, as understanding, as maturity. It's not. What looks like a man giving space is often a man deciding that asking for anything is pointless. And once that belief sets in, something else starts to happen. He stops looking at the relationship as a place where his needs will be met. He starts looking elsewhere. Not always physically. Sometimes it's emotional. Sometimes it's just mental distance. A recalibration of where he expects to find connection. This recalibration doesn't happen overnight. It's gradual. He starts noticing which conversations feel safe and which feel like burdens. He starts tracking which requests get dismissed and which get ignored entirely. He starts measuring the gap between what he contributes and what he receives. And slowly, without announcing it, he stops trying to close that gap. This is where the confusion usually starts. Women notice the distance eventually. They notice the man has become less engaged, less present, less interested. And the default interpretation is that he's selfish, that he doesn't understand how hard it is, that he expects her to handle everything and still cater to him. But that's not what happened. What happened is simpler. He stopped being treated as a priority, so he stopped treating the relationship as one. Let me say this clearly. I'm not talking about the first few weeks after a baby is born. I'm not talking about postpartum recovery. I'm not talking about survival mode. I'm talking about what happens when survival mode becomes the permanent state. When the emergency becomes the structure. I've watched this pattern repeat across years. A woman has a child, and from that point forward, her husband becomes a support role. Not a partner, not someone whose emotional and physical needs still matter. A support role. Someone who helps with logistics. Someone who provides. Someone who waits. And most men do wait. For months. Sometimes for years. They wait for things to return to how they were. They wait for their wife to turn her attention back toward them. They wait for intimacy to resume. They wait for conversation that isn't about schedules or problems. They wait for any signal that they still occupy a meaningful space in her emotional world. And while they're waiting, something else is happening. The relationship is being redefined without negotiation. The terms have shifted. The man is no longer someone who receives focused attention, affection, or priority. He's someone who gives those things, or is expected to, while receiving less and less in return. Now here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. When a man stops waiting and starts looking elsewhere, the response is almost always moral outrage. How could he? After everything she's been through? After everything she's handling? But the framing is wrong. The question isn't why he left. The question is, at what point did he stop being treated like someone who matters? I'm saying this directly because it needs to be said. Having a child does not erase the fact that you're still married. It doesn't pause your responsibilities to your husband. It doesn't create a temporary exemption from maintaining the relationship. And yet, that's exactly how it gets treated. The assumption is that the man should understand, that he should be patient, that he should accept being deprioritized indefinitely because the child needs more. And he does understand. He is patient. But patience isn't the same as acceptance, and understanding doesn't mean he stops having needs. What most women don't see is that the moment they stop treating their husband as a priority, they're making a choice. They're signaling that the relationship can wait, that his needs can wait, that he can wait. And men internalize that signal very differently than women expect. When a woman deprioritizes her husband, she usually thinks she's making a temporary adjustment. She thinks she's asking him to be reasonable during a demanding time. She thinks he understands that this is what's required right now and that things will balance out later. But that's not how it registers. What registers is, I'm no longer important here. My presence is optional. My needs are negotiable. And once that belief takes root, the relationship doesn't recover just because the child gets older. It stays recalibrated. Here's what I mean. A woman spends years focused entirely on her child. The husband becomes background, someone who exists in the house but isn't really engaged with emotionally, someone who provides stability, income, logistical support, but who isn't really seen, isn't really desired, isn't really prioritized. And then one day, she notices he's distant. He's less affectionate. He's less interested. He's not initiating. He's not pursuing. And she's confused. She thinks, what happened? Why did he change? But he didn't change. He adapted to the environment she created. An environment where his needs were consistently deprioritized. An environment where asking for attention, affection, or intimacy was met with exhaustion, resentment, or dismissal. An environment where he learned that expecting anything was unrealistic, so he stopped expecting. And once that shift happens, it doesn't reverse easily. You can't spend years teaching someone they don't matter and then be surprised when they stop acting like they do. The interesting part is what happens to his behavior during this adaptation period. He doesn't become openly hostile. He doesn't create conflict. Instead, he becomes strategically unavailable. He works longer hours. He finds hobbies that keep him occupied. He builds a life structure that doesn't depend on emotional reciprocity from his wife. This isn't punishment, it's protection. He's reorganizing his expectations to match the reality he's living in. And women often misread this completely. They see a man who's suddenly busy all the time and assume he's avoiding responsibility. They don't recognize it as avoidance of disappointment. They don't see that he's stopped bringing his needs to her because bringing them has consistently resulted in nothing. I've seen women try to re-engage years later. The child is older. Things are less chaotic. And suddenly she notices the emotional distance and wants to reconnect. But by then, the damage is structural. The man has already adjusted his internal map. He's already recalibrated what he expects from the relationship. And often, he's already found connection elsewhere. Or he's simply stopped looking for it at all. This is the part no one wants to talk about. The idea that a woman might be partially responsible for her husband's disengagement. The idea that years of deprioritization might have consequences. The idea that you can't treat someone as optional and then be shocked when they start to believe it. I'm not saying this to assign blame. I'm saying it because the pattern is consistent, and pretending it doesn't exist doesn't protect anyone. If you stop investing in your relationship will reflect that. If you treat your husband as someone whose needs can be indefinitely postponed, he will eventually stop bringing those needs to you. And when that happens, the relationship doesn't end dramatically. It just becomes hollow. Two people living parallel lives, coordinating schedules, managing a household, raising a child, but no longer functioning as a romantic partnership, no longer operating as two people who prioritize each other. The final point I'll make is this. The shift doesn't require cruelty. It doesn't require anger. It doesn't even require awareness. It just requires consistent deprioritization. It requires a man to realize, slowly, that his wife no longer sees him as someone worth focusing on, that he's been moved to a maintenance category, that his presence is assumed, but his satisfaction is no longer a concern. And once that realization settles in, the relationship changes in ways that can't easily be undone. Because you're no longer dealing with a temporary imbalance. You're dealing with a man who has learned, over time, that he doesn't matter the way he thought he did. That's not something you fix with a conversation. That's something you prevent by never letting it happen in the first place.